Title: The Texas Isolationist Church Collapse. 300 people vanished in 25 years. Across the limestone ridges of Llano County, the wind carries more than dust. It carries the silence of a congregation that once claimed spiritual purity through isolation. Between 1952 and 1977, over 300 individuals vanished under the guidance of a religious movement that preached withdrawal from the world, the rejection of medical care, and the severing of all family ties. Official records label it a voluntary collective. Former members call it a prison in disguise. For decades, state agencies dismissed the disappearances as migration or divine calling. But what remains buried in the dry Texas soil tells another story. The Shepherd's Veil Fellowship presented itself as a sanctuary of obedience and grace. Founded in 1949 by Reverend Isaac Mather, a World War I veteran turned preacher, the church acquired 8,000 acres west of Kingsland, Texas. By 1952, it claimed 600 members, most of whom lived on church grounds in prefabricated housing and subsisted on communal farming. Mather preached that the outside world was infected with moral disease and that only complete isolation could preserve the soul. Local authorities rarely entered the property. Members worked, worshipped, and died without ever setting foot in a town again. For years it was considered a model of devout rural self-sufficiency. But public perception masked an unseen attrition. Congregants disappeared without farewell or funeral, often after perceived spiritual failings. No grave markers, no departure notices, just voids. By the spring of 1952, the Shepherd's Veil Fellowship was nearing its height. A drive west on Ranch Road 1431 led visitors past rusted cattle gates and scattered mesquite until the barbed wire perimeter of the church compound came into view. Tall wooden crosses stood at intervals. A single white structure, labeled the Hall of Rectitude, marked the entrance. Everything beyond that point was unseen to the general public. But in regional Baptist newsletters and conservative radio broadcasts, the fellowship was heralded as a rebirth of sacred discipline. Reverend Isaac Mather, nearing 60 by then, rarely gave public interviews. When he did, he spoke with calculated precision. "We are not a cult," he said during a brief 1953 phone interview with the Llano Times. "We are what the frontier intended: uncorrupted, self-reliant, righteous." Few questioned his word. Mather's military service and his frequent citation of American values made him palatable even to skeptics. His sermons were circulated by mail, and excerpts appeared in the back pages of national religious journals. He drew donations from retirees in Oklahoma and Arizona, and by 1955, the church had built its own grain silo and medical shack, although the latter was staffed only by an unlicensed practitioner known as Brother Alton. The fellowship's rules were publicly available but steeped in euphemism. Non-congregant contact prohibited except in trade. Correction through silence encouraged. Departures to be processed through witness review. These terms sounded bureaucratic. Internally, however, they were more severe. Survivors later testified that correction through silence meant public shunning lasting weeks, during which the accused could not speak, be spoken to, or share meals. Witness review was not a departure interview, but an accusatory tribunal, often held before dawn, where members confessed sins and named others. Despite its rigid structure, the compound attracted families. Between 1953 and 1961, at least 115 families relocated permanently to Shepherd's Veil. Most were drawn in through word of mouth or family connections. Testimonies from those who escaped decades later revealed that many joined out of economic desperation or disillusionment with post-war American consumerism. The promise of moral clarity, a guaranteed roof, and food seemed worth the price of isolation. To local law enforcement, the community posed no clear threat. Sheriff Willard Cranston of Llano County conducted a single site visit in August 1954 after a rancher reported hearing screams at night. Mather greeted him personally and offered coffee. The sheriff's notes, later uncovered in a retired file box, describe peaceful if peculiar folk. The report ends with the phrase, "No women or children visible during the visit, possibly off-site." Church-led events occasionally opened to outsiders, such as the annual harvest convocation, where pre-screened guests could tour a designated portion of the land. These tours were choreographed, fields were tended, children sang hymns, and uniformed men stood smiling. In reality, large sections of the compound remained off-limits, including what members referred to as the dry quarter, an arid, fenced-off zone where those under correction lived in tents or dugouts. Few returned from it. By 1958, records show an unusual trend. Families who had joined the church no longer maintained contact with relatives outside. Christmas cards stopped, phone numbers were disconnected, births went unrecorded. A grandmother in Temple, Texas, reported her daughter's family missing after 5 years of silence. She received a letter from the church signed by Clerk Isaiah stating, "The family you inquire about has transcended to life more abundant. We urge you to seek peace and refrain from worldly attachment." No further information was provided. Church accounting ledgers, seized years later, documented internal transfers of property and vehicles from new members to communal assets. While legal under Texas trust law at the time, these transfers meant that upon joining, families effectively surrendered all assets. There were no exit clauses. A departure meant poverty, shame, and estrangement, or worse. Yet the press remained largely uninterested. The Austin American printed a glowing profile of Mather in 1959 titled "Pastor of the Pure Texas Man of the Year," describing him as stern but sincere. The reporter admitted to only seeing 1/3 of the property. Meanwhile, internal church correspondence urged members to reject all outside temptation, even in memory. This included burning of photos, letters, and books brought from the outside. Children born on site never knew cities existed. Between 1952 and 1962, Llano County death records mention only 11 fatalities attributed to the Shepherd's Veil Fellowship. But property logs show that over 120 adults ceased to be listed after initial registration. Their fates were never recorded. Local morticians received no bodies. When questioned years later, surviving elders cited heavenly transition or the fading of the unfaithful. No state agency followed up. A dusty green ledger found during the 1991 civil probe into abandoned properties in Llano County contained meticulous inventories of canned goods, wool distribution, and a page titled "Departed, Names Stricken." Next to each name was a date, a 3-letter code, and a red checkmark. The codes repeated RCL, SLV, WTK. None matched any known medical or legal abbreviation. Investigators speculated they referred to categories of excommunication, relocation, or something more final. The names stopped abruptly in 1977. A former congregant, interviewed anonymously in 1983 under the alias Paul, had escaped the compound at age 19 by hiding inside a delivery truck after unloading eggs at a San Angelo market. His testimony, recorded in a low-budget documentary that aired once on late-night public television, described what happened after a name was stricken. "You're not killed," he said, "but you're disappeared. It starts with a reassignment, no warning. You're told you failed. You get moved to the dry quarter. No one speaks to you again. If you're still there a month later, they come for you at night. They say they're taking you to reconciliation. After that, no one asks, no one dares." The reconciliation compound was not marked on any official maps. Satellite imagery from later years revealed 3 concentric rings of fencing deep in the northern sector of the property. The innermost ring enclosed a structure described by some escapees as the Grey Barn, a windowless building with reinforced hinges and a corrugated tin roof. Despite multiple raids in the early 2000s, after the land reverted to county ownership, the barn had been stripped clean. Soil analysis found calcium-rich residues, consistent with livestock rendering or mass cremation, though no bodies were recovered. Throughout the 1960s, changes in state law required tighter record-keeping for births and deaths, but Shepherd's Veil was allowed to self-report due to its religious designation. Reverend Mather and his clerks filed all vital statistics through a private courier, bypassing direct audits. They claimed a consistent birth rate, but rarely submitted death certificates. No formal medical care was documented. When questioned, church representatives maintained that the community relied on faith treatment. though internal journals describe the use of herbal compresses, fasting rooms, and isolation chambers for physical and spiritual ailments. Children born within the compound were assigned a numerical designation alongside their biblical name: Ruth 2:21, Ezekiel 3:09, Naomi 1:78. According to recovered internal memos, these numbers were used to track labor assignments and spiritual status. By age 5, children were enrolled in obedience rotations, where failure to meet behavioral benchmarks resulted in food denial and outdoor confinement. A 1975 memo titled Child Compliance Trends referenced heightened detachment in Naomi 1:78 and non-responsive behavior in Ezekiel 3:09. Neither name appeared in any subsequent records. A handwritten note at the bottom of the same page read, "Possible transfer to WTK if no change by 4/2. Outside inquiries were rare. When distant relatives tried to visit, they were met by gatekeepers who recited pre-written statements. The family you seek has been rejoined with the greater body of the faithful. They do not welcome interruption." Even in cases where legal guardianship should have reverted to kin, particularly after the death of a parent, no transfer was granted. The state of Texas issued no injunctions, in part because many records were incomplete or missing entirely. Property deeds were listed under obscure trusts or marked as religious land grants. Internal discipline operated through a tiered punishment system. Level 1 involved public confession and dietary restriction. Level 2 added physical labor, usually in the form of trench digging or fence repair under full sun. Level 3 was referred to in all logs as SLV and consisted of solitary confinement in subterranean cells built during the compound's early years. These cells, according to architectural sketches found in a 1968 planning memo, were dug 5 feet below ground, lined with limestone and sealed with bolted hatches. Food was delivered once per day through a chute. Sanitation was absent. A full SLV term lasted 30 days. Survivors described it as the month of silence. Paul described the aftermath of SLV in harrowing terms. You come out hollow, and everyone sees it. They avoid you like you're contagious. Most people don't last long after that. A week, maybe 2. Then it's RCL and no one sees you again. He believed that the trauma of SLV was intentional, not as correction, but as filtration. They want to see who breaks. Then they erase the ones who do. Marriages were arranged by a committee known as the Alignment Council. Courtship was forbidden. Couples were notified of their pairing via scrolls delivered during the Thursday evening sermon. Dissolution of a marriage was possible only through confessional petition followed by a vote. Children born to such unions belonged legally to the church, not to the parents. During rare visits from county officials, elders presented only the most obedient children, rehearsed and uniformed, while others were locked in soundproof dormitories. In 1969, a former elementary teacher from Houston named Marion Talmadge attempted to visit her sister, who had joined the church with her 2 children 4 years prior. Talmadge's requests were denied multiple times. She filed a missing persons report, but the local sheriff declined to act without evidence of a crime. In a desperate move, she contacted the Houston Chronicle and shared her story. The paper published a brief article on page 12 of the Sunday edition under the headline, "Woman Seeks Kin in Isolated Faith Group." The church responded with a public letter in the same paper the following week, accusing Talmadge of stoking secular division and claiming her sister had renounced her family. The matter faded quickly. Talmadge received no further updates. Beneath the external image of orderly worship, fractures were visible to those who looked closely. Satellite images taken in the early 1970s by surveyors hired for oil rights inspections showed irregular burn patterns in the western fields. Geologists consulted during later investigations theorized the patterns were not natural, but consistent with recurring fire rituals or controlled destruction of materials. No explanations were offered. By the mid-1970s, Reverend Mather was reportedly infirm, confined to a personal residence known internally as the Inner House. Control shifted to a triumvirate of senior clerks, Brother Thaddeus, Sister Miriam, and Clerk Elijah. Their leadership style was colder, more bureaucratic. Sermons became less about scripture and more about data. Charts of spiritual compliance were posted publicly. Children were ranked by obedience. Food portions were rationed based on perceived worthiness. A culture of internal surveillance emerged, with members assigned to monitor others and file weekly behavior reports. One such report, recovered from a pile of weather-damaged papers in a storage shed years later, detailed a 4-year-old named Lemuel 344 who had refused to recite a psalm. The note recommended preliminary WTK exposure under supervision. Marginalia indicated the child's father objected. His name was stricken 2 weeks later. As the decade closed, whispers began among younger members about escape. A group of 6 teenagers attempted to flee in 1976. They were caught outside the southern gate. What happened to them was never recorded. Their numerical designations, Judah 455, Esther 491, Abel 462, Simeon 458, Leah 475, and Micah 477, were all erased from internal documents dated after that spring. One remaining scrap of sermon notes, dated April 4, 1976, contained a single line: "The weeds have been cleared from the garden. Praise the purity of the body." In late 1963, a social worker named Edith Kinner filed a routine request to visit all religious collectives in Central Texas as part of a state-mandated welfare oversight initiative. Her notes from the period indicate she was particularly interested in child development within isolated communities. Kinner had visited Mennonite farms, Pentecostal revivalist camps, and small Franciscan retreats without incident. When she attempted to schedule a visit to Shepherd's Vale Fellowship, she received a formal rejection letter, typed on cream stationery with the church seal, a wheat stalk crossed with a shepherd's crook. The letter read, "Your inquiry is acknowledged but declined. We possess no wards of the state and receive no public funds. Our children thrive under spiritual jurisdiction." Kinner was advised not to pursue further contact, but she did. According to her personal journal, which resurfaced in 1999 in a box of estate donations to the Texas Women's Historical Archive, Kinner attempted to follow up with the county health department. She requested vaccination records, growth tracking, and school performance data for children listed under the church trust. Her request was returned with a blank note reading, "No records available under those names, unable to verify existence." Kinner persisted. In early 1964, she traveled to Kingsland and visited the town's general store, the post office, and a farm supply shop that did business with the church. At the hardware depot, she interviewed a driver who made semi-regular deliveries to the outer gate. The man, identified in her notes only as Don, mentioned that each time he made a delivery, the truck was unloaded by silent teenage boys, their heads shaved, their clothes identical. He never saw any girls. He described the boys as robotic and said they never spoke even when directly addressed. Don told Kinner, "They don't look at you. They're trained not to. I don't think they even know how to smile." That phrase haunted her. She wrote in her journal, "If these children are incapable of smiling, then what kind of life are they living? I don't believe this is choice. I believe this is suppression masquerading as piety." Kinner filed a complaint with the Texas Child Welfare Division, noting suspected neglect and emotional abuse. Her claim was closed within 2 weeks. The response cited lack of jurisdiction and insufficient probable cause. Kinner's name would appear only once more in state correspondence, listed in a 1965 memo from a deputy director who called her well-meaning but overzealous. By the late 1960s, several subtle signs had begun to emerge that something inside the fellowship was decaying from within. During a rare inclement winter in 1967, a local veterinarian named Howard Lorber was summoned to the outer perimeter to assist with sick livestock. He was granted limited entry, escorted by 3 men in long grey robes and instructed not to speak to anyone else. Lorber, in a 1982 interview for a regional radio show, recalled what he witnessed. "They had this young girl holding the goat, couldn't have been more than 12. She looked at me, but her eyes were vacant, not scared, just like no one was home. I remember asking her name. One of the robed men snapped, 'She has no name, only designation.' That chilled me." Lorber treated the goat, left without issue, and never returned. He did, however, make a report to the Burnett County Livestock Authority mentioning inappropriate child labor and unreported livestock deaths. The report was logged and forgotten. In 1970, a small evangelical paper out of San Marcos published a reader-submitted letter from a man identifying himself only as J.L. The letter recounted a visit to Shepherd's Vale during their harvest convocation in 1968. He wrote, "The place was spotless, orderly, and strangely lifeless. No laughter, no play. Even the dogs didn't bark. What chilled me most was seeing a group of small children cleaning grave markers with toothbrushes. One of the elders told me it was a sacred rite of humility, but the kids weren't kneeling in prayer, they were shaking." The letter prompted a mild stir among the paper's readership, but no investigation followed. The editorial board included a disclaimer that the letter reflected the opinion of the author and that the Shepherd's Vale Fellowship had long been considered a lawful religious body. During this period, a pattern began to emerge. Those who visited the compound even briefly often left with a deep unease, yet found no formal mechanism to raise alarm. The church's legal standing as a religious trust insulated it from standard oversight. Its geographic isolation made casual surveillance nearly impossible, and most chillingly, its members, those who might have told the truth, had been conditioned into ritualized silence. Not all signs of trouble were hidden. In 1972, a volunteer fire crew responding to a brush fire near the southern border of the church property reported seeing what they believed was a mass transport of soil from one part of the compound to another. They described wooden carts filled with dark, dense earth, hauled by teenagers in identical robes. The fire chief, Samuel Orvis, noted that there was no visible cause for the movement, and no construction nearby to justify the quantity of soil being moved. He later commented, "It looked like they were burying something, or unburying it. Either way, it wasn't farming." Orvis attempted to follow up with the church's designated liaison, Brother Alton, who dismissed the observation as seasonal trenching for water flow. No maps or plans were offered to support this explanation. The incident went unreported. One of the most revealing glimpses into internal decay came from an errant letter that surfaced in 1974. A woman in Lubbock received a postcard addressed to her sister, who had joined the fellowship in 1957. The card was written in a child's handwriting and postmarked from Marble Falls. The text read, "We have learned the rules and keep them. But I still remember snow. Do you remember me?" It was signed Ruth 221. The woman showed the card to a local pastor who contacted the sheriff. The sheriff reached out to the church. Days later, the woman received a second letter from the fellowship's legal representative stating that Ruth 221 had died 5 years earlier of fever, and that any communication otherwise is fraudulent or malicious in nature. The postcard was dismissed as a hoax. No further inquiry occurred. A former postal clerk from Marble Falls, interviewed decades later, remembered the incident. She claimed the card had been mailed alongside 2 others with nearly identical penmanship. None of the recipients ever came forward. By 1975, reports of missing persons linked to the fellowship had quietly accumulated. At least 35 were formally filed across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. All involved family members who had joined the church between 1952 and 1970. In each case, the final correspondence from the missing individual contained similar phrasing. "I have entered a season of obedience. I will not write again." Law enforcement viewed the statements as proof of voluntary separation. The law at the time allowed religious organizations broad autonomy, especially if no one formally declared an intention to leave. Only one investigator pressed beyond the surface. Marcus Kellin, a young field agent with the Texas Department of Public Safety, opened a quiet inquiry in 1976 after learning that 2 siblings from El Paso, ages 12 and 14, had not been enrolled in any school district since their family relocated to the compound in 1972. Kellin drove to Kingsland and attempted to make contact. He was refused entry at the gate and told to submit all questions in writing. He did. 3 weeks later, he received a letter signed by Clark Elijah stating, "Our children are instructed under divine statute, as is permitted under state law. Further interference will be treated as harassment of a religious body." Kellin attempted to verify the children's welfare through the county records office. No educational or medical documents were available. He filed a preliminary concern. His supervisor advised him to close the file unless criminal conduct could be proven. Kellin closed the file. The year 1977 marked the last time any known outsider was officially permitted inside the Shepherd's Vale Fellowship perimeter. That spring, a visiting theology professor from Dallas, Dr. Bennett Tice, was granted brief access after requesting permission to observe communal liturgical practices for a comparative study on American separatist movements. His credentials, published works, and ties to conservative evangelical networks made him an acceptable candidate in the eyes of the church's clerical board. Dr. Tice entered the property with a single notepad, a small camera, and a letter of permission signed by Clerk Elijah. He was assigned a minder named Brother Isaacson, who accompanied him for every step of the visit. In his field notes, which remained unpublished during his lifetime but were recovered posthumously from a university archive, Tice described his experience as eerily symmetrical, emotionally desolate, and choreographed beyond the point of natural behavior. He observed morning devotions in a long, windowless hall where rows of men and women knelt in absolute silence. The air was dense with the scent of dry grain and wax. Children stood perfectly still at the edges of the room, their eyes fixed forward, never straying. Tice was not permitted to photograph the ceremony. When he asked about the absence of spontaneous prayer or song, Brother Isaacson responded, "Our joy is inward. External display is a form of pride." Tice noted that no members addressed him directly, not even in passing. He attempted to make eye contact with one boy, who immediately lowered his gaze and stepped back. Meals were eaten communally but in silence. No utensils. Men and women sat separately. Every motion was measured. No laughter. No private conversations. It struck Tice that even during brief moments of rest, congregants remained under constant observation by robed overseers who carried thin ledgers and whispered among themselves. Later that evening, he requested to interview one of the elder women to ask about her life before joining the fellowship. The request was denied. He was told that personal pasts are surrendered at entry. Recollection weakens obedience. Tice was allowed one final tour of the agricultural facilities, which included rows of storage sheds, a smokehouse, and a tightly secured outbuilding labeled Archive. When he asked about its contents, Brother Isaacson replied, "Only clerics may touch the books. You are not sanctified for that knowledge." Tice departed the next morning. His formal report, submitted to his department weeks later, focused only on ritual and structure, omitting any mention of his emotional impressions. Privately, however, he wrote in his journal, "This is not a church. This is a controlled environment where individuality has been eliminated under the guise of holiness. The children are the quietest I've ever encountered, and the eyes of the adults, empty. I fear that something monstrous is being disguised by their order." Less than 4 months later, all contact with the church ceased. The outer gates were no longer manned. Letters sent to the main address were returned unopened. Trade deliveries were refused. Visitors reported silence and locked barriers. Some speculated the fellowship had entered a period of deep seclusion. Others believed something worse had occurred. In November 1977, a Kingsland repairman named Craig Hall was contracted to repair a fallen telephone line on the outskirts of the property. According to a statement he gave years later under subpoena, Hall wandered close to the southern fence line while tracing a faulty line. There he found a burnt clearing filled with charred posts and bent metal frames. The area smelled of ash and something else, something sour, like decay. Hall claimed he saw a small foot protruding from the soil. He fled the site and reported what he saw to the Llano County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Raymond Tuller was dispatched to investigate. His notes from the call, preserved in a cardboard storage box and rediscovered in 2004, detail the following. Traveled to fence line. No visible signs of trespass. Burned brush consistent with seasonal clearing. No body found. Area quiet. No visual confirmation of report. The case was closed within 2 days. Hall was never contacted again. That same winter, a cold front descended on the hill country, driving temperatures to record lows. A neighboring rancher reported seeing a column of smoke rising from inside the fellowship property each evening for 5 days. He assumed they were burning wood for heat. It wasn't until years later, during a drought-induced soil erosion event, that charred bone fragments were discovered in a wash basin downstream from the fellowship's border. Forensic tests confirmed that the bones were human. The remains were fragmented, partially calcified, and showed evidence of intense heat exposure. No identities could be established. The discovery was logged but never linked to a criminal case. By then, the Shepherd's Vale land was in legal limbo. Taxes had gone unpaid. No representatives remained to speak on its behalf. Yet one final set of documents surfaced, tucked inside a filing cabinet sold at auction from a defunct real estate office in Burnett County. The cabinet, filled with miscellaneous church deeds and water rights applications, contained an envelope labeled Restricted SLV and WTK Coordination. Inside were 15 typewritten pages detailing procedural directives for internal transfers. One page bore the heading WTK Criteria, Minor Subjects. It listed triggers for transfer: failure to complete prayer recitation, repeated questioning of assigned tasks, crying without cause, refusal of assigned food. The final section outlined handling: subject to be escorted at nightfall, no verbal comfort to be offered. Parents, if applicable, must be present but silent. Reassignment follows within 24 hours. A handwritten addendum signed Miriam stated, "We cannot afford further disruptions. Weakness must be identified and removed before it spreads. Hesitation from parents must be corrected with immediate SLV." This document, more than any other, confirmed what many had long suspected: that the fellowship had engineered a system of removal for undesirables, children included, under a veil of spiritual justification. WTK, never formally defined, was mentioned again and again in margins and memos. Most researchers now believe it stood for wilderness to keep, a euphemism for exile or extermination. 2 years after the fellowship's collapse in 1979, a woman identifying herself only as Sister Rachel contacted a reporter from a small news station in Waco. Her face was never shown. Her voice was distorted, but her words carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who had lived inside the system. "We believed we were holy, we believed we were special, but we were taught that love is punishment, that obedience is the only virtue." Children who showed fear were corrected. Those who failed were disappeared. No one asked why. If you did, you were next. The reporter, unable to corroborate her identity, aired the interview once on a late-night segment. The station received no follow-up inquiries. The footage was stored in their archives, where it remained untouched for decades. By the end of the 1970s, the land once occupied by the Shepherd's Vale Fellowship stood empty. The fields went fallow. The fences decayed. The roads cracked. Wildlife returned to the perimeter. The silence that once masked the machinery of obedience now carried only the wind. But scattered remnants remained. In a dry creek bed, children's shoes half buried in sediment. In a collapsed outbuilding, nameplates with numerical codes. In a locked filing drawer, a list of arrivals with 3 columns: given, number, and departure code. Most of the names were marked with the same initials, WTK. In September 1991, the state of Texas approved a land reclamation initiative targeting dormant properties across Llano and Burnett counties. Parcel 4097B, an 8,000-acre tract once occupied by the Shepherd's Vale Fellowship, was flagged for inspection. It had lain fallow for nearly 14 years. Deeds had defaulted. No representative had emerged to claim ownership or maintain tax obligations. On paper, it was abandoned ground. 3 state contractors were assigned to survey the land for potential repurposing. They arrived with topographic maps, boundary records, and aerial photographs dating back to 1975. Their job was simple: document existing structures, assess soil viability, and flag any environmental hazards. None had been briefed on the history of the site. What they found altered the scope of the project entirely. The initial walkthrough began at what had once been the compound's main eastern entry. The road, once paved with crushed limestone, had crumbled into a wash of weeds and broken stone. Two large wooden beams marked the entry, their crosspieces charred but intact. A rusted bell engraved with the words "In Silence Truth" hung motionless in the breeze. One of the contractors, Arnold Delisle, noted in his field log, "Area feels deliberately emptied, not overgrown, maintained just enough to suggest someone comes back occasionally." As they moved westward into the core of the compound, they encountered remnants of the Hall of Rectitude. The structure had partially collapsed, but key architectural elements remained. Its foundation was sound. A portion of the sermon dais was still identifiable, though stripped of decoration. Rows of wooden pews had been overturned and burned, leaving blackened outlines on the floor. Scattered throughout were children's schoolbooks without covers, all identical in format, titled "Lesson of Service, Age Tier 3. In a shallow alcove behind the dais, a metal filing cabinet was bolted into concrete. The lock was broken. Inside, the contractors found 31 green folders, each labeled by season and year, ranging from spring 1968 to autumn 1976. The contents were a mixture of duty logs, spiritual performance graphs, and reports titled "Failure Notes." Each file contained a table of names with behavioral assessments, ranging from compliant to fractured. Certain entries were underlined in red and followed by initials: SLV, RCL, WTK. Delisle, unfamiliar with the meaning of these notations, copied 5 pages and mailed them to the Austin Historical Registry out of curiosity. The documents were reviewed by archive researcher Ellen Partridge, who had studied American religious separatism for over a decade. She recognized the terminology immediately. Partridge contacted the state. Within weeks, the Texas Department of Public Safety launched an exploratory probe into Parcel 4097B, initiating the first formal inquiry into the Shepherd's Veil Fellowship since its disappearance. A multi-agency team was assembled quietly. It included members from the State Forensic Unit, 2 cultural anthropologists, and an archivist. Their task was to investigate whether the compound's collapse involved unlawful activity. For political reasons, the scope was limited. No public statement was issued. No warrants were obtained. Initial forensic sweeps focused on soil anomalies around the area, referred to on church maps as the dry quarter. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a grid of subsurface cavities. Excavation began cautiously. Over the course of 3 weeks, the team uncovered 6 distinct underground cells. Each measured 5 feet wide, 8 feet long, and was sealed by rusted hatch doors. Inside, conditions were barren: no bedding, no sanitation fixtures. One cell contained a rusted bucket and a water pitcher fused with mineral deposits. Scratched into the limestone walls were sequences of marks, tallies, prayers, and names. One repeated set read, "I will return obedient. I will return obedient." Elsewhere on the property, surveyors discovered remnants of what appeared to be a ceremonial clearing. At the center stood a circular stone foundation, 15 feet in diameter, charred at the edges. Scattered around it were dozens of partially melted glass fragments, shards of wooden icons, and a line of broken child-sized shoes arranged in pairs. Soil samples from the burn pit revealed high concentrations of calcium phosphate, carbonized bone matter, and traces of human keratin. No intact bodies were recovered. The team documented and preserved the site, but refrained from classifying it as a burial ground without confirmation. One anthropologist, Dr. Inez Caldwell, published her observations years later in a university journal under a pseudonym. She wrote, "The silence of the land was not neglect. It was curated absence. These spaces were not left behind. They were vacated by ritual. Every object here was stripped of identity and meaning before being discarded. Even the shoes had no names." Among the most disturbing discoveries was a set of stone tablets found in a cellar beneath what had once been the Alignment Council's residence. The room was partially collapsed, but accessible through a sidewall. The tablets, carved into crude limestone blocks, contained lists of names etched in long columns. Each name was paired with a numeric designation and an exit notation. Most ended with the same 3 initials, WTK. In the back of the cellar, partially buried beneath collapsed beams, a water-damaged chest held several locked notebooks. One was recovered intact. Its pages, written in a meticulous hand, belonged to Clark Elijah. The notebook's entries spanned from March 1975 to January 1977. One page read, "Ruth 221 continues to disrupt harmony. No response to second discipline. Parent unit resists correction. SLV assigned. Transfer to WTK scheduled for equinox. Body must be broken for the soul to be rejoined." Another page, dated October 1976, described the group disappearance of 6 juveniles. Judah, Esther, Abel, Simeon, Leah, Micah, all under observation for 2 months. Attempted defection confirmed. Decision unanimous. Ceremony to proceed without parental witness. Entries removed, garden restored. Each entry was signed with the symbol of a curved staff beside a closed eye. With these findings, the inquiry team assembled a preliminary report suggesting systemic abuse, coerced disappearance, and the possibility of extrajudicial deaths. Their internal summary, marked confidential, used the phrase functioning eradication mechanism embedded in faith hierarchy. However, lacking identifiable remains or surviving perpetrators, the team was unable to pursue criminal charges. The statute of limitations had lapsed for all civil infractions. No living member of the former fellowship had been located. In 1994, the state quietly designated Parcel 1497B as culturally sensitive land. No development would proceed. The area was fenced off, patrolled twice yearly, and reclassified on maps as a historic religious zone. No signs were installed, no memorials erected. The silence remained. The discovery of Clark Elijah's notebooks triggered a brief ripple through a small academic circle that had followed religious isolationist movements in the American South. One of these scholars, Dr. Meredith LaRue, was granted limited access to the internal report from the 1991 site investigation. Her initial response was disbelief, followed by obsession. She petitioned the Texas Historical Commission for access to the property. After 2 denials, she secured entry under the pretense of cataloging architectural features of frontier-era religious buildings. She was given 3 days. LaRue arrived in March 1996, accompanied by a graduate student and a hired local guide. The weather was dry, the landscape sun-bleached and brittle. The fields were strangely even, no tall brush, no trees regrown, just low yellow grass, uninterrupted. Inside the remnants of the Alignment Council building, she found the walls lined with shallow carved symbols, identical eyes, closed, flanked by sheaves of wheat. The ceiling had long since caved in, but a fireplace remained intact. Within it sat a rusted tray filled with coins, old dimes, bottle caps, and several brass rings. Each was engraved with a number. Her assistant noted that none bore names. LaRue photographed everything, then paused before the hearth. She reached behind a loose brick and felt paper. Wrapped in waxed linen was a child's drawing in graphite. It showed a large rectangular structure with small windows, a fenced courtyard, and 6 figures holding hands. Above them, scrawled in uneven letters, were the words, "We remember even if they said forget." The paper was creased but dry. She tucked it into her notebook and said nothing. Back in Austin, LaRue began comparing known membership logs with county disappearance records from 1952 to 1977. Over 6 months, she cross-referenced 312 names. Of those, 241 matched known missing persons cases involving individuals who joined the Shepherd's Veil Fellowship or had relatives inside. The remaining 71 were children born on site whose births were never formally recorded. None had death certificates. She presented her findings at a closed seminar hosted by the Southern Institute for Religious Trauma. Her presentation, titled "Obedience and Disappearance: The Bureaucratic Logic of Faith-Based Erasure," outlined how the fellowship had masked the removal of hundreds under a legally protected religious structure. Her data included scanned ledgers, exit codes, and maps of the dry quarter. A week later, the university that had hosted the seminar received a cease and desist letter from a private legal firm based in Abilene. The letter claimed LaRue had accessed state-protected records without proper clearance and was disseminating speculative materials harmful to faith groups. The university issued no public statement. LaRue was quietly advised to shift focus. She refused. Her tenure application was denied the following year. She left academia in 1998, but not before submitting copies of her documents to two independent archival projects, the Texas Oral Histories Collective and the Displaced Faith Registry. Years later, these would form the backbone of the first open-access database cataloging suppressed religious abuse cases in the American Southwest. In 2003, a maintenance worker clearing brush near the southern fence of Parcel 4097B stumbled upon a collapsed pit covered with iron sheeting and dirt. Below it lay a chamber, approximately 10 feet wide and 12 feet deep. The walls had been reinforced with stone. Along the perimeter were decayed wooden shelves. What remained on them were dozens of identical cloth bags, now rotted through, their contents exposed to air. Inside the bags were children's possessions, paper dolls, wooden blocks, small shoes, finger-drawn devotional booklets. Each item had a tag bearing a number. One block, painted with the letter R, had a strip of fabric tied around it. Scrawled in faint ink were the words, "For her to find if I don't come back." The site was closed within 24 hours. A tarp was laid, soil was replaced. No public notice was issued. Internal documents refer to it as the South Cache. A quiet internal recommendation was made: install permanent fencing, reinforce signage, and continue biannual inspections. All personal effects were placed into sealed evidence storage in Austin, catalogued but never displayed. Around this time, local oral traditions began to surface in nearby towns. Elder residents, now in their 70s and 80s, recounted childhood memories of seeing strange processions of silent people on the highway. One man remembered riding his bicycle near the edge of the compound and being stopped by a woman in a grey robe. She pressed a note into his hand and said, "If you can read this, they haven't taken your name." The note was gone by the time he got home. His mother burned his clothes and told him never to speak of it again. In 2007, a researcher named Lydia Hahn from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children began correlating unsolved child disappearance cases across the central states. While reviewing cases from 1950 to 1980, she noticed an unusual concentration clustered near Kingsland and Llano County. In multiple cases, families had relocated to join a promising spiritual retreat or a biblical cooperative. Each report ended similarly. Letters ceased, phone lines disconnected, no forwarding address. Hahn found 52 such cases. She filed a federal inquiry. The response stated that without evidence of abduction or foul play, these disappearances cannot be pursued under federal statute. Her request to review internal documents from the 1991 site probe was denied. That same year, a former member of the fellowship surfaced. She used the name Ruth, no last name given. Her face was obscured in every recording. In a series of taped conversations with an independent documentarian, she described life within the compound in granular detail. "We were ranked every day," she said. "Points for silence, for stillness, for how quickly we dropped to our knees when the bell rang. If you cried, you lost points. If you asked a question, you lost everything." She described her removal from her parents at age 6. Her new unit was assigned. 1 adult, 7 children, all under 12. The adult's name was Miriam. She was known as a shaper. She told us our birth names were burdens, that we must forget them to be clean. She would stand over us and whisper, "Your thoughts are too loud, God hears them. If you don't silence them, He'll take you away." Ruth described nights when children were taken from their bunks and returned days later, bruised, silent, unwilling to speak. Some never returned. She described WTK as a place with no songs. When asked if she ever saw it, she said, "No, but I heard the carts." Her final memory before fleeing was of a boy named Ezra who refused to kneel during morning rites. He was dragged by 2 older boys into the dry quarter. Ruth followed the sound later and found only his shoes and a scorched patch of earth. When asked how she escaped, she said only, "I remembered my mother's voice, that was enough." The footage was shown once at a small human rights conference in Portland. No distribution followed. The original tapes remain in a private archive, available by request only. By 2010, Parcel 4097B was referred to in internal state documents as non-interference terrain. All entry was halted, no development permitted. The area remains unmarked on most public-facing maps, labelled generically as private tract. No names, no identifiers, just silence. In the spring of 2013, an independent researcher named Malcolm Reed posted a series of encrypted documents to an obscure sub-forum devoted to lost settlements in the American South. His files, titled Witness Protocols, Shepherd's Veil, included scans of internal memos, training materials for new congregants, and 15 pages of disciplinary tables with categories labeled Behavioral Anomaly, Youth. Each page included an unseen section clipped or redacted. Reed claimed to have received the materials from a former maintenance contractor who had worked briefly on site cleanup efforts in the late 1990s. Within days, the post was removed. The forum was shut down. Users who had commented reported receiving warning emails from unknown administrators. Reed vanished from all known online channels. His last verified message was a private reply to another user, which read, "They weren't just isolated. They engineered isolation into a weapon." That phrase would later appear in a short-lived documentary produced by a Scandinavian public broadcaster. The film The Vanishing Ground aired once in 2015 before being pulled for contractual irregularities. Its footage included a nighttime drone pass over Parcel 4097B, showing strange geometric depressions in the grass. One frame captured a shadowed figure standing still along the western boundary. The narrator stated, "There is no official caretaker, and yet the land is watched." Despite the growing archive of evidence, no prosecution ever occurred. Survivors who came forward did so in anonymity, scattered and untraceable. Local authorities either deferred to state jurisdiction or cited lost records. The land itself was shielded by a network of quiet designations: environmental concern, historic registry, and non-permitted religious zoning. By 2018, no markers had been placed, no memorials established. Parcel 4097B remained a place without public story. Teachers in Kingsland didn't speak of it. Maps showed a flat white patch. Surveyors avoided it. Some called it cursed, others refused to say its name. But memory persisted in fragments. A retired postal worker named Clara Hemisath, then 83, kept a scrapbook in her garage. It contained letters she had sorted from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s. Many were addressed to the fellowship. Some bore children's handwriting, others the formal tone of estranged parents. One envelope bore no stamp and simply read, "If she still lives, I'm sorry." Clara never mailed it. She kept it folded between two articles clipped from the Llano Times, one announcing the church's founding in 1949, the other listing a brush fire near the property line in 1977. Beneath it she had written, "No return address." She had once tried to speak to a supervisor about the letters. She was told, "They aren't our concern." That place has its own rules. She carried the memory into retirement. At night she sometimes heard a song she hadn't known she remembered, a child's hymn with only 4 notes, sung slowly, wordless. Other traces lingered elsewhere. In a low-security storage room at the Texas Department of Vital Records, a mislabeled microfilm reel contains death reports from 1963 to 1975. Several entries include notations from the fellowship. One reads, "Departure by internal fire, no remains." Another, "Rejected recitation 3 times. Heart ceased without worldly aid." One line, attached to a minor under the name Ezekiel 309, simply reads, "Removed. Memory closed." A researcher named Dalia Contreras found the reel while reviewing rural mortality anomalies. She reported it to her department head. Within a month, she was reassigned. She never saw the reel again. Private citizens continued to investigate. A man in his 40s named Brian Lechner published a memoir in 2019 titled My Brother Stayed. In it, he described growing up in a small town west of Austin. His older brother Jonah joined the fellowship at 17. Brian was 10. The family received letters for 6 months, then nothing. When his parents died, Brian found a box containing Jonah's letters, a recruitment pamphlet, and a final note from someone named Brother Alton, thanking the family for releasing Jonah to the narrow path. Lechner returned to the site in 2015. He hiked past the posted warnings and reached the edge of the old dry quarter. He found only dry earth, faint outlines of burned structures, and a single shoe nailed to a beam. It was child-sized, aged by son. Inside was a piece of cloth with the number 455. Lechner photographed it. Weeks later, his apartment was broken into. Only his laptop was taken. No prints, no suspects, no report filed. His memoir received limited attention. A few podcasts mentioned it. An article appeared in a regional literary review. Then silence. Lechner withdrew from public view. Despite the suppression, the landscape itself refused total silence. In 2021, a record-breaking drought caused deep fissures to open in the land. Near the northern border of parcel 4097B, a sinkhole formed. Within it were remnants of structural beams, charred linens, and fragments of clay jars. One bore a message etched into the base. They said I was too loud to be loved. The discovery was unreported. Locals fenced it with cattle wire. No officials arrived. In an unrelated review of land use rights that same year, a junior clerk at the county records office flagged a deed transfer with a timestamp from 1977. The transfer listed the property's control as passed to the Custodial Shepherd Trust, a body with no board, no public address, and no known representatives. The signature on the document was a single curved line beside a closed eye. The clerk reported it. The record vanished from the database within 2 weeks. In 2022, a podcaster named Lena Marsh began a serialized investigation titled The Vale Recordings, focused on forgotten institutional disappearances. Episode 7 was dedicated to the Shepherd's Vale Fellowship. Unlike others before her, Marsh did not attempt to sensationalize. She played audio from public hearings, read archived letters aloud, and included anonymized interviews with 2 survivors who had never spoken publicly. One survivor, identified only as Miriam 102, described being taken at age 5 to what she called the whisper room. Her account, recorded over the phone, was halting and flat, interrupted by long pauses. "It wasn't punishment," she said. "It was meant to undo you. No sound, no movement. If you cried, they said your soul was leaking out. They'd come with the stick and mark the floor next to you, 1 mark for each sound." She recalled the smell of limestone and old cotton, the silence broken only by a bell she could never see. After 7 days, she was told she was pure again. She never spoke above a whisper after that. Her voice on the recording was barely audible. Marsh's series received modest attention online, then abruptly stopped. Her final posted update read, "This one follows you home. I'm stepping away." All episodes were later pulled from major platforms. Independent mirrors preserved only fragments. Despite decades of accumulated evidence, no legal inquiry into the Shepherd's Vale Fellowship was ever formally reopened. Every attempt faced procedural barriers. Expired statutes, destroyed records, unverifiable testimony. No grave sites were officially declared. No mass investigation was launched. The case remains categorized as a religious dissolution, not a criminal event. In 2023, a fire burned across the western border of parcel 4097B, ignited by a lightning strike. When emergency responders arrived, they found the blaze oddly contained. Vegetation had burned evenly, forming a perfect oval around a central structure. Inside the charred circle was the outline of a wooden frame, long since collapsed, and 6 rows of what appeared to be child-sized cots, scorched to ash. No identifying remains were found, but embedded in the soil beneath the cots were iron tags, each bearing a number between 462 and 491. Nearby, one responder found a single, intact page from a devotional workbook. The last line read, "When we return, it will be as light." The page was turned over to local authorities. No report followed. In a rural library in San Angelo, a reference copy of the 1959 Faithful Sour newsletter sits unindexed. Inside is a full-page profile of Reverend Isaac Mather. The photo shows a tall man in a pressed jacket, standing beside a young boy holding a sheaf of wheat. The caption reads, "Reaping Souls for the next world. The boy is not named. Behind him stands a shadowed figure, whose face is partially obscured by glare. On closer inspection, the figure appears to be wearing a collar pin shaped like a closed eye. The librarian says no one has ever asked to copy that page. Outside official channels, some have tried to document what they call the legacy of the fellowship. In 2024, an artist named Ari West held an installation in Austin titled Unnumbered. The exhibit included a wall of children's shoes arranged in concentric circles. Each shoe bore a tag with a biblical name and a sequential number. Visitors walked in silence. An audio loop played recordings of wind, footsteps, and a low bell chime. No signage explained the meaning. Critics were divided. Some called it an act of grace. Others dismissed it as trauma art. West gave no interviews. The exhibit ran for 1 month, then was disassembled. The shoes were donated to a shelter. Each pair came with a note that read, "You are not erased." Elsewhere, digital archivists continued compiling the scattered remnants. A volunteer project called the Departure Index now lists 318 names believed to be associated with unexplained vanishings within the Shepherd's Veil Fellowship. Each entry includes available information: age, date of last contact, known relatives. Some entries have photographs, most do not. Many have nothing but a name and a number. Scrolling through the index feels like touching smoke. Entries marked Unknown 177, Ezra 455, Leah 475, sit beside Simeon 458, and Naomi 178. None list a place of rest. Each one ends with the same line: final status, unverified. Despite increasing public access to these materials, official recognition remains absent. No apology has been issued, no state resolution passed, no federal acknowledgement made. The land remains sealed, entry prohibited. Those who drive past it at night report strange impressions, a sense of stillness more complete than silence. Some say they see figures near the fence line. Others describe low chanting with no source. One woman traveling alone from Marble Falls claimed she saw a procession of barefoot children walking in pairs beside the highway, robes grey with dust. When she stopped, they were gone. Her phone recorded a single line of audio, wind, and the sound of a page turning. The file is dated April 4th, 2024. The same date 6 names were removed from the Shepherd's Veil ledger in 1976. When questioned, the woman said only, "They walked like they knew where they were going." And still the records remain incomplete. Families still wonder. Elders who remember choose not to speak. The space where 300 lives vanished remains cordoned in silence, protected by laws not built for what happened there. And beyond the fence, nothing moves. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.